Welcome today to everybody who's joining us for our discussion on RADx, which is a fantastic, really important program in the US toolkit that's been developed for addressing COVID-19, but has really revolutionized how we address infectious disease threats, big picture. So thank you for everyone who's joining us today. My name is Christine Parthemore. I'm the CEO of the Council on Strategic Risks. CSR is a nonprofit, nonpartisan think tank dedicated to analyzing and addressing systemic risk to security in the 21st century. CSR has numerous projects dedicated to driving progress in reducing biological threats and advancing biosecurity. Of course, the devastation of COVID-19 and the ongoing pandemic drives home that the United States needs to continue increasing its ambition in this area of addressing biological threats. The positive news is that we're more technologically capable than ever before in terms of preventing future outbreaks from becoming pandemics and causing widespread damage in the future. But that requires us to learn lessons from the ongoing COVID-19 experience, and it's critically important that the nations sustain and then expand upon what has worked well. I'm honored today to host key leaders of one of the nation's exceptionally successful programs in this area that drove innovation and raised public-private cooperation to new levels to address the COVID-19 pandemic. It is the RADx initiative, which stands for Rapid Acceleration of Diagnostics. And today, to share more about this program and what it's done, I'm joined by three of its core leaders, Dr. Bruce Tromberg, Dr. Jill Heemskerk, and Dr. Rachael Fleurence. So RADx is a program at the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering that supports rapid development, commercialization, and implementation of technologies for COVID-19 testing. The program has been truly unique and game-changing, which our guest today will describe in terms of getting accessible and easy testing into homes and medical centers all across the country in terms of helping to fight the spread of infectious diseases. RADx should, we believe, serve as a model for addressing disease threats beyond COVID-19 as well. I'm so grateful to our guests for taking the time to share their work for us today, which we hope provides some insights both on their current work and how it's going to evolve to continue fighting this ongoing pandemic that we have for us and hopefully create even better models to rely on in the future. Through the conversation, please submit any questions you may have using the Q&A function. We will pull out selected discussion questions toward the end of the webinar for our guests. Our panel today features, as I mentioned, three great leaders of this program who've designed and implemented it. We'll start with opening remarks from each, followed by a few discussion questions that I will share, and then we'll move on to audience questions with them. To start, Dr. Bruce Tromberg is director of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering at the National Institutes of Health and co-chair of the RADx Tech program. Prior to joining NIH in January 2019, he was professor of biomedical engineering and surgery at the University of California, Irvine. Bruce, RADx seems to be one of the most promising programs in the US toolkit for addressing infectious disease risks. Can you start by telling us more about the RADx program and how it functions and what has made it so unique?
Sure. Thank you so much, Christine. And thanks to the council. Thanks to our colleague, Matt Hepburn, for introducing us to you and the opportunity to present to everyone today. I'm going to go ahead and share some slides. I can answer a few of those questions with a presentation. And also, we're very grateful to a large group of people at NIH, our collaborators all around the country, and I'll get into a little bit more detail on that, how we've built a consortium of experts all around the country to contribute to this public-private partnership. But to kind of set the stage, let me go back to April of 2020. I'm sure everybody remembers back in those days. There really were not enough tests, and this was brought up by Senators Alexander and Blunt. If you look on the right side of the screen, this is the editorial that they wrote that appeared in April 20, 2020. And it was in the Washington Post calling for more COVID-19 tests and propose a Shark Tank to get us there. And this just 4 days later led to the fourth congressional supplement. $1.5 billion in that supplement went to the NIH. In fact, $500 million went to NIBIB to do exactly this, expand COVID-19 testing technologies, the number, the type, the accessibility, and optimize their performance, both the technologic and operational performance, and do a better job of matching community needs. So if you recall, back in April, laboratory tests were the dominant form of testing. You really needed a prescription from a physician to have a test. You needed to be symptomatic. The nation was doing around 7.5 to 8 million tests per month. And it was really difficult to match the tests with the needs of every different setting. Our goal then was to rapidly expand point of care and over-the-counter tests so that ultimately these would exceed lab tests. We wanted to get to tens of millions of tests per month, and we formed immediately partnerships all across the government with every relevant agency and HHS and DoD. You can see there the nice insignias there of all the agencies that we formed very strong working relationship partnerships. Now, 5 days after that appropriation on the 29th of April, we were able to launch the program because we built it on an existing network that NIBIB had supported. It's called the Point of Care Technology Research Network. We expanded this network quite dramatically, bringing in about 900 experts and contributors from all across the country in government, academia, industry, and not-for-profit sectors. The core participants in the network are Johns Hopkins, UMass, Northwestern, Georgia Tech Emory, and CIMMYT, the Innovation Center at Mass General Hospital. And we built in some essential functionalities into this network, a core to be able to validate every technology that came into our process, a clinical studies core that would look at and establish standard trial design and digital health platforms to be able to evaluate technologies in the field very, very rapidly, and a deployment core to deal with issues like supply chain, manufacturing, building up a user community. And our principal arm for making all this happen is the innovation funnel. This is illustrated on the left side of the screen. We opened up a call for this funnel. In the first 24 hours on April 29th, we had 400 applications started. We ended up having 824 total applications. This funnel process, I won't go into details on, but ultimately, if you made it through these various stages of review, and it invokes kind of those notions of the Shark Tank, we made 50 phase 2 awards, which could be in the tens of millions of dollars to get you through to manufacturing and distribution of your products. Now, along the way, over the past 2 years, we've realized there's more to it than just the innovation and getting technologies out there. We have to test them in real life settings. So we established additional programs to do that and networks to evaluate this. Say Yes COVID Test, COVID-19 Test Us, the RADx Variant Task Force to look at the impact of variants on test performance, an independent test assessment program with the FDA to dramatically accelerate over-the-counter test authorization processes, and then educational tools like My COVID Toolkit, whenTotest.org, and finally issues on test accessibility, which you'll hear more about from my colleague Jill Heemskerk pretty soon. So what's the bottom line? The impact of all of this, if we look over the past 2 years, the cumulative test capacity from our investments has been 2.6 billion tests. This actually far exceeds what we anticipated in the first place. In April of 2022, RADx Investments, those companies were generating about 330 million tests in that month. If you recall, our initial goal was hopeful to be able to generate tens of millions of tests. So this has really, really taken off. A large part of this drive, of course, has been the roller coaster of the pandemic and the ascendance of Omicron and its infectiousness. So we've also, in the process, been able to create tests to meet that need and drive a paradigm shift from primarily laboratory-oriented tests to point of care and home tests. So in fact, in February of 2022, we hit a peak of about 1.1 billion tests. Those are both lab and point of care and OTC, but 1 billion of those were over-the-counter tests that were distributed. And these were fueled in large part by the government's procurement and the establishment of covid.gov, that website, to be able to distribute those tests. So what are the ongoing challenges? First, improve performance and information content. We want tests to work better. OTC antigen tests are great, but we have the technologies to make them work even better and to make them more accessible to everyone. So for populations with visual, fine motor, cognitive impairments, and my colleague Jill Heemskerk will discuss some of that. Regulatory is always a potential bottleneck, and our active management and engagement with the FDA has been extremely important in this process. Sustainability, as I mentioned, there's been procurement and distribution, but that's not a market-driven approach. So we at some point will have to go back to that payer model, that market-driven approach. Maybe we can leverage some of these platforms for other pathogens and diseases to keep warm-based manufacturing going, and even chronic diseases. And finally, impact. Every time there are new tests and new technologies that are developed, we have to assess how they work in the real world. And we need to get better reporting mechanisms of all of those tests. So if there are a billion tests that are being done in people's homes, public health and even personal health would benefit from having pathways to report those. That can actually help facilitate and enable diagnostic-led precision medicine or test-to-treat paradigms in the home. And my colleague Rachael Fleurence will talk about some of those concepts.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for that overview of the program. And a paradigm shift is absolutely the right terminology. It's hard to even imagine where we would be with this pandemic had this not occurred as a counterfactual, but certainly makes the case for why we need to maintain that new paradigm going forward as well. Thank you so much. And now next, as Bruce mentioned, we'll hear from Dr. Jill Heemskerk, who's Deputy Director of the National Institute of Biomedical Imaging and Bioengineering, and also serves as the co-chair of the RADx Tech program. Previously, she's held numerous leadership posts, including as Deputy Director of the Division of Adult Translational Research at the National Institute of Mental Health, is Acting Director of the Office of Translational Research at the National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, among many other great experiences and leadership posts she's held. And she's led RADx's efforts in making COVID-19 testing more accessible to different populations. Jill, over to you to speak a little bit more about that aspect of the program.
Thank you, Christine. I'm hoping you can see my slides. The initiative I'm going to tell you about to make at-home tests more accessible came up because once the government launched the COVID.gov effort to distribute home tests to people's homes across the country, there was a lot of public outreach that pointed out that the current home tests are not really able to be used independently by everyone, particularly people with disabilities. And so we held a listening session with the advocacy groups who had reached out, as well as 6 federal agencies who have accessibility as part of their mission. And we wanted to understand better what the challenges were from the perspective of people with blindness and low vision, people with fine motor impairment, and the aging population. We also have used this as a jumping off point for a partnership that's been ongoing. This listening session happened at the end of March, and we've had nearly weekly meetings with representatives of these advocacy groups and federal agencies since then. But we learned a tremendous amount during this listening session, and you can get a flavor of that here. What really were the challenges from the user perspective? They fell into roughly 3 categories. One big problematic area was the test packaging and the instructions. Particularly for people with blindness, receiving a package in the mail from the government without any identifiers of what kind of test it was meant they couldn't look up the instructions accessibly on the internet. For lots of people, the packaging of the test and the components is very difficult to open and manipulate. The instructions are very complex with tiny print and few language options. And then the procedure itself is, for people that have taken these tests, we all know there's so many steps, and involving fine manipulations like counting drops of liquid into tiny holes on the device, little teeny parts, and instructions that say to add liquid to the top of the test, but no indication that that someone who is blind could use to know which is the top and which is the bottom of a test. And the instruction, don't touch. That's how people with low vision figure out what it is they're dealing with. And so that's a real deal breaker for them. Similarly, across all of the groups, having no clear result readout, expecting people to interpret their test result from a faint little line on a tiny device is challenging for really most people. And although some tests have readers that communicate with smartphones, smartphones aren't accessible to everybody. And in these particular groups, up to 40% of people don't have access to smartphone technology. So this list of concerns that we heard about was viewed from the RADx perspective as a really interesting challenge to take on. And we're approaching this in two parallel ways. The first, to take the shortest path possible, we're trying to modify existing tests to make them more accessible. And from the roughly 100 companies in our portfolio, we've identified 25 tests through a review that seem amenable to improved accessibility through modification. And we have now established a pipeline by making contracts with experts in accessibility evaluation and designing for accessibility. And we've now had these 25 tests reviewed for accessibility and identified 11 that are going to now be the subject of a design effort to identify modifications that can improve accessibility. Once the designs are developed, we'll then pass these through an expert design review that will involve the end users to make sure that the designs will solve the problems from their perspectives. And throughout, we've been working with manufacturers who, as it turns out, are really interested in this effort and eager to apply the lessons learned both for their next generation COVID tests as well as tests for other disease areas. We're also working closely with the FDA because any of these modifications are likely to require data collection and review. And so what we're envisioning is that over the next 3 to 18 months, there will be more accessible tests available. Even at the shortest end of this, modification, for example, of the instructions to simplify the instructions will require some regulatory review. And so even something as straightforward potentially as that will take time. And of course, over the coming 6 to 18 months, modifications that require retooling and scale up manufacturing will be slowly coming online. We're looking through this pipeline at modifications for the different groups who require more accessibility, because some of the groups require different things than others. Ideally, though, we all agree that new designs that started with accessibility in mind at the outset would be ideal, rather than this shortcut of modifying existing tests. And so this is in our minds as part of our longer term development efforts to bring on tests with improved performance. We're going to be baking in broad accessibility into those designs right from the start. So I'll stop there and send it back to you, Christine. Thank you.
That's fabulous. Thank you so much. And it's, again, a perfect example of taking an important lesson and applying it going forward. But also, of course, the inequities that have come about in COVID treatment and the spread of the disease and testing and everything have been really devastating on top of all of the other damages that this has caused to society. And so knowing that your program has been at the forefront of thinking about this and trying to fix it is really, really fantastic. So grateful for that and for you sharing this part of the story of RADx with us. Thank you. And next, our third panelist is Dr. Rachael Fleurence, who serves as Senior Advisor to the immediate office of the Director at the NIH and as the Special Assistant to NIH Director for COVID-19 Diagnostics. She's currently serving as Senior Advisor to the President's Science Advisor at the White House. Dr. Fleurence co-led the RADx Advanced Technology Platforms program and led the novel Say Yes COVID test program to understand the effects and challenges and get keen evidence on how tests are being used and what they do for us. So she'll be speaking to us more about that. She has an incredible background in driving evidence-based change, and she's helped to lead a game-changing experiment in how rapid testing can really change how communities are addressing infectious disease threats. So welcome, Rachael, to tell us a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Christine. Can you hear me okay? Excellent. So yeah, thank you so much for the invitation to speak with Bruce and Jill about the RADx program, and in particular the program that I co-led, which is the Say Yes COVID test program. So I'll give folks on the call just a little bit of a kind of overview of what this was. It was a partnership with CDC and NIH and the local public health departments to offer residents of communities free rapid tests that they could use from the privacy of their own homes. So I know all this sounds very kind of routine now, but think about a year and a half ago, this was not routine at all when we started planning this program. So the communities that we reached out to could order their tests online, but we also had places where they could pick them up at community centers. Each program, each community that we went into had 1 million tests offered to them. The public health departments were very strong partners with us and led the community engagement part. We had a website and a digital app where people could record their test results, but also get help on how to actually use the test. We had a focus on underserved and vulnerable populations. I'll talk a little bit more about that and how the communities were selected. Bruce mentioned there was test result reporting to public health. There was also a survey involved so that we could understand a little bit more about how people were using these tests at home. So back in the winter of 2021, so we're talking January 2021, so about 18 months ago now, we had several key questions about home tests. We were wondering whether people would order them or pick them up, whether they would, whether we'd be able to reach underserved populations, whether they would have access to free tests. We wanted to know if people would follow our guidelines, which were to test 2 to 3 times a week to monitor for infection. We wanted to know if they would report to the public their results to public health department using the app. We wanted to know on the larger scale if actually providing free tests to a large community could break community transmission. And then we wanted to understand if the program was scalable or not. So these were the questions that we had entering into the program. A quick overview of our timeline. We started planning in November, December of 2020. We launched in March 2021, and across, and then we had communities spread out from March right through December, and we were in North Carolina, Tennessee, Michigan, Georgia, Hawaii, Kentucky, Indiana, Washington State, New Hampshire, and the state of Vermont. So in the end, we actually went statewide in certain places. Overall, at the end of the program, we had distributed 6.8 million tests, and about 2/3 were ordered online and 1/3 were picked up at community providers. But these numbers shouldn't necessarily reflect people's preferences. They were more sort of where the tests were available and how people were able to access them. So a few things that we learned just based on our survey that I thought I would share with you. And of course, you know, as things progressed last year, these were important learnings as the White House COVID response started to prepare whether they would distribute the tests for a federal program or not. They were kind of listening to our updates in the summer of 2021 to kind of better understand sort of, you know, what people were doing and how they were using this. So from our survey results, people did prefer online ordering. So that, I mean, I guess, you know, if I guess once you have the information, being able to just order them at home is a preferred way, and that makes sense. But we still think that having some community pickup centers is important for populations who don't have access to internet or who don't want to use internet to provide that kind of information to the government or even to the local state public health department. We did find that community partners and community organizations were very important, the trusted sort of local folks when we were doing community distribution. So that was very helpful. I mean, what we did notice as the program evolved from March, you know, that these early times in March 2021 right through December, is the demand for the test really increased over time. So you could really tell the public was getting more and more educated and knowledgeable about the use of home tests, and the demand was much higher. Around just a few things about test result reporting. In the early stages, we had very few people report their results voluntarily to the public health department. But one important thing to say is that's largely because they were not using the app at all. The tests were sort of so obvious in terms of how to use them that they weren't actually going onto the app to get help. Those who did go onto the app, actually 80% of those ended up reporting test results. So we think it's not just a problem of people being hesitant to report test results. It was also just that we weren't getting them onto the app to report results, because once they were on the app, they were pretty willing to do that. Just a few other things I'll say. So I mentioned that we from the survey, we understood they preferred online ordering to actually picking them up. Our initial guidelines were for people to test 2 to 3 times a week and just to monitor for infection. And what we found out is that people were not doing that. Only about 10% of people used them that way. Most people used them if they'd been exposed or if they were going out somewhere where they wanted to know their own status, which I think is that's probably how most people use them today as well. And I will say from our survey, there is a proportion of folks who said that they had no interest in ordering home tests. So we did a market research survey that included people who had not ordered tests, and some of those just hadn't gotten around to it, but some of them just said they had no interest at all. So there are segments of the population that at the time anyway were not interested in home tests. So just for a few concluding remarks. So we've certainly come a long way since March 2021 when we launched, and we were really having to make the sell to the community partners, to the local public health departments. You know, there were concerns about, are these tests sensitive? Do they work? Are people going to be able to know what to do with the results? Is it going to make transmission worse? So these were sort of the early questions. And by the end of the program, we did not have to make the sell anymore. We were being contacted by different states to sort of help them with their distribution. I'll say just a few of the barriers we encountered. So at the time we launched, there was a scarcity of tests, so it wasn't easy actually even for our program to get the number of tests we needed. But we're not in a scarcity world anymore, so that's changed. There were a number of stakeholders who were maybe resistant, I'd say, to kind of home testing, including some of the federal agencies where that just hadn't been the norm, and then groups such as, you know, the public health labs, clinicians. That's just not how things had been done, and that's where the real, I think, revolution happens this year in terms of home testing. And you can really see that both public health departments and local residents are increasingly comfortable with home testing. Just a few more points. I really have less than a minute here. I think under the urgency and with a large amount of funding, it is possible to develop, authorize, manufacture billions of home tests that people, by and large, actually know how to use and while understanding their limitations. So there's no question here that home testing has undergone a huge revolution, and that we might, that I think there's going to be a demand from the public for more home testing in other infectious diseases such as flu and RSV, but probably more. And then I'll say just the last point is that there are many areas where improved point of care diagnostics is going to help with access to early treatment and care management. And that's, you know, Bruce was mentioning on the COVID front, but that's true in other diseases as well. And so particularly if you think about underserved populations, rural populations, hard to reach populations, point of care diagnostic can be really life-changing or game-changing in terms of their ability to treat and access treatment quickly. So anyway, I think we hope that all the learnings that we've had from the COVID response and the infrastructure that's been built will really be able to pivot to these areas of greatest need. And these are the end of my remarks. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. That's fantastic. And I love how layered the experiment was of this program, that you were trying to discover so many different things because this was just such new territory, and really collect evidence about how things were going to inform decision making. That alone is fantastic to learn about. But some of the findings, again, seeing the revolution, what we have today that we did not at the start of this pandemic is just exceptional. So thank you so much for sharing that element of the program as well. I'll send a few questions now as we're collecting the questions from the audience, which we appreciate everyone sending in. And then after a few of mine, we'll turn to the audience ones as well. To start, so one of the things that we've talked about, I know Bruce, you and I and others have exchanged in the past, that RADx was really exceptional in creating a public-private ecosystem and treating the problem that was to be solved in that manner. Can you talk a little bit more about what that is and how it's unique to RADx, and an example or two of how it has worked in sort of being so game-changing in the testing environment?
Sure, thanks, Christine. I think that's really foundational in the entire structure. We needed innovation, and we needed the technology, the entrepreneurial community to really buy into this. So we basically sent a call out. We asked people for help. Fortunately, we had a structure in place. So our POC-turn network was the one upon which, that was the scaffolding that we could add all of this additional functionality. And what's really quite different from traditional NIH types of grants, where the recipients get money and then they write an annual report or something like that, this became a very dynamic, intensive, actively managed process. So DARPA has a well-deserved reputation for that kind of engagement, but this went to another level of intensity. So every one of our programs, the Innovation Funnel, Say Yes COVID Test, the ITAP program, the Variant Task Force, these are operating because there are small groups, working groups, committees at multiple levels that are composed of people in private sector, in industry, in not-for-profits, in academia. The Innovation Funnel, for example, we made it easy to get into the funnel. So all you had to do was have a pretty good idea. You could be an academic group, you could be like a little garage shop, but we also had mid-sized companies and large companies applying. And then the next level of review, the so-called Shark Tank, was very intensive. And it was a week-long process with hundreds of person hours of effort put into that. Those people that were doing the Shark Tank, they weren't the stars that you see on TV. They were people who came from academia, who came from industry, who came from not-for-profits, from government, and had expertise in every one of the domains that we knew all the technologies had to hit: the technologic performance, the clinical need, the marketing concepts, the ability to manufacture and the knowledge of that, the experience and savvy of the investigators. So all that was evaluated and scored. It was kind of like maybe a 1 year or 6 month venture review, all compressed into a week to a week and a half. And then we could make funding decisions at the NIH based on all of this input and structure, actively managed. And then if you got funding, you had to hit milestones. Those reviews were actually done by people from all of these different backgrounds, and evaluations of whether or not you could move on to the next level were active, dynamic collaborations. We effectively gave every project a board of directors, and they didn't meet quarterly. They met multiple times per week with each of the projects to make sure that they would get to their goals. So that's probably the most highly evolved example of active, dynamic, intentional public-private partnerships.
That's excellent, thanks. And I know there has been some work on this already, but I feel like there needs to be a flurry of case studies about just exactly this aspect of how these different sectors in private and public sector actors can work together going forward, and so quickly. Obviously, it's a huge personnel surge, but there was a lot more to it than that structurally had to be there for this to succeed. So thank you. And it's you and the other speakers sort of took us back a little bit in time to, I know many of us want to block out some of the earliest phases of the pandemic in terms of what life experiences were like for ourselves and our loved ones, and for the nation and the whole world for that matter at this. But the idea of having tests that you can do in your house Many women are pretty comfortable with this, I would say. It's, we all have pregnancy tests, and there's some familiarity with these for a few infectious diseases and for certain conditions like pregnancy and things like that. I think it's growing more common, but there was a lot of resistance to at-home testing at the beginning of COVID. As you've all explained, I think that that's really changed, and the evidence that you've all built has helped to change that equation. But if we think about future outbreaks, nailing them and crushing them and stopping the transmission before they become pandemic scale, this is going to have to be a component of it. I think that's very clear at this point. So what do you have, or others have ideas on what sorts of things we have to do to make that happen and make sure that this change of people by and large becoming very comfortable with what at-home tests can do as one component of the solution? How do we solidify that gain?
So let me just jump in quickly. I have two thoughts on that. So first of all, pandemics are a roller coaster. I mean, everyone knows that. Everyone's personally experienced that. We don't know what the problems are going to be. Many of our federal agencies are pretty, they have a way of doing things, including the NIH, but the Engineering Institute at NIH, the NIBIB, we're much more flexible. We're sort of the design, build, test people. We're obsessed with problems and solving them quickly. So I think part of the success of this is the engagement of this community, the engineering, entrepreneurial, technology-driven community. Off-the-shelf technologies are not the answer to pandemics. Off-the-shelf policies aren't the answer. We need flexibility, and we need this dynamic, application-oriented problem-solving capability in all of these sectors. So getting us engaged, I think, was important, and we're sufficiently flexible and malleable that we could go into the gaps between the different agencies and figure out ways to bring people together, to work together, to build on everyone's strengths. That was kind of an accident as a result of a phone call between Dr. Collins and Senator Alexander that sort of led to that editorial. I happened to be on that call, and sort of the rest is history. The second part is this has really grown, like you mentioned, pregnancy testing. So I think that's maybe 8 to 9 million tests a year. In February of 2022, we hit 1 billion tests in a month. So the scale is unprecedented, and the adoption has been absolutely incredible. And that's been driven by continued government investment. If this is just entirely left to market forces, we'll never really de-risk the technologies that need to get us to the point of having cool stuff in the first place. And then if we are subject to the roller coaster fluctuations of demand, and Rachel alluded to these demands going up and going down, if it's entirely market driven, if there's no regular cadence of investment in this, then we're always going to be out of phase. So when there's the biggest pandemic, the manufacturing lines are scrambling to get up. And then when it drops down, you can have a lot of manufacturing, but not necessarily a lot of demand. So there's going to be shrinkage. So those two things are very important.
Good, and definitely problems to be worked through going forward, but hopefully will not become hindrances in continuing this progress. Thanks. I'm going to start weaving in some of the audience questions as well. The first one I think was directed toward Jill specifically on the accessibility side. It's a great question, including for continuing work on COVID-19, but for the future as well. In terms of making tests more accessible, there are certainly, I'm sure, pros and cons between making every test more accessible or having some tests that meet specific accessibility needs, but maybe more expensive, and then making sure that those are targeted at the populations that need them and that they get to those specific populations. Jill, can you speak a little bit about certainly I'm sure there would be costs and logistics and things involved. Do you all have any information or insights on some of the pros and cons about those two different approaches?
So at a very high level, those two approaches describe our parallel efforts. The long-term universal design effort where accessibility will naturally be a part of any test that's produced will kind of solve that problem, that, how to get the particular tests to the people that need them. If they're all accessible to everybody, that's the ideal state. But our short-term efforts now to modify existing tests, some of the criteria that we have are not adding a lot of cost, because adding cost is an accessibility issue in itself, an equity issue. So modifications that can be made without adding a lot to cost are one of the things that our designers and engineers are thinking about. And then as far as getting them to the people that need them, one of the other criteria is, can the particular test be manufactured at scale? Is it a high volume test? So what we'd like to do is make even the modified tests quite freely available, so that they're available in retail, they're available through government programs, and there doesn't have to be a very specific targeting of the people that need them necessarily. So we're kind of thinking big in that way. If you think about things like low vision, manual dexterity, cognition, these are things that affect the elderly population, which is enormous. So it's, getting an accurate count is not so easy, but if you have lots of them, that's where we want to be.
Excellent. That definitely sounds logical. And again, in terms of making, breaking down those lines in society too, so that everyone sees everyone and understands the broader community needs, I think is a helpful approach from a societal perspective as well. The next question, y'all can correct me if I'm wrong. Rachel, you might be the best one to answer it. But jump in for whoever wants to reply to this one. And that is, there a strategy for continuing to develop a unified approach for reporting and capturing the results of home rapid tests? So I think there is a little bit of answering this throughout the case and potentially in the chat, but for those just listening to this session, sort of where do we stand and where do we think we're going on the sort of pulling the results together in a more unified way?
I'll say a few words and then I'll let Bruce say a few words as well. So technically, I think we could say that technically we've solved the problem, that the pipes are there. I have colleagues at NIH and Dr. Andrew White, Dr. Krishna Jularu, who've been working with the Office of the National Coordinator and other important groups to identify the common data elements, the right pipes going into the public health department. So from a technological standpoint, it's absolutely possible for people to be pushing their test results back to public health departments. They're also, my colleagues are also working with all the manufacturers to see if they can standardize that across the different home tests. I think the bigger push is the cultural one, is people in their homes being comfortable and feeling that there's some use in them reporting their test results. And I don't think we're there yet. So there's going to have to be a big kind of, I don't know if a public education campaign is the right word, but I think people are going to have to feel that there's a reason why they report their tests and why they should take that extra couple of minutes to do that. And I don't think we're there yet. But Bruce might have more to say on there's a lot going on right now at his institute in terms of that, on that front.
Yeah, thanks, Rachel. And I think you set this up really perfectly. We have been working for quite some time on putting the structures in place to be able to facilitate reporting. But because this has really never happened, certainly not at this scale, there actually were no standards for over-the-counter test reporting, either for personal health or for public health. And in general, the public health and epidemiology structures are suspicious of home tests and their reporting. They prefer to have fewer reported laboratory tests than to have lots of reported home tests. But the bottom line to all of this is that the laboratory test domination of the test landscape of in vitro diagnostics is kind of over. The cat's out of the bag. There are billions of home tests out there. People like them. And I think people's perception of reporting home tests is changing and will continue to change. Unfortunately, right now, there is no easily identifiable public reporting pathway. I think to most people, it would make a lot of sense if you went to covid.gov and you got your tests there. Could you not just press a button and report a positive or negative test anonymously on covid.gov? So that's one of the things that we're trying to promote but that's not our decision to make. We are certainly advocating on behalf of that. What we've done is we've built the back-end structures to do that in a way that's compatible with all the standards that are out there. That's the RADx MARS, Mobile Application Reporting Standards. And now the only way to do it is manufacturer by manufacturer, working with each app and creating in the app a front end, a user interface to help facilitate those reports. But people aren't that comfortable with downloading apps from every different manufacturer. Maybe if you begin to develop some brand loyalty and you just get tests from maybe 1 or 2 manufacturers, you might want to do that. We did start with iHealth, the single largest distributor of tests. In February, I think they contributed about 300 million tests to the US market. So in the month of May, this was actually up and running, and iHealth tests were getting reported through the app without any advertisement. Nothing was going on. And we got around 135,000 tests reported. And the data, to me, look incredibly interesting and useful. And we are just going to keep pushing expanded experiments. Some states are very, very interested in this. I think part of our key for adoption is we work with APHL, American Public Health Laboratories. They are the service that reports tests from all laboratories and puts them into data hubs and sends them to public health, ultimately to HHS Protect database. So we have worked with and partnered with APHL, as well as with ReportStream, which is the USDS-supported government entity, to get tests reported and ultimately make it into data hubs and into HHS Protect. And because we've done that, APHL already has a culture for laboratory test reporting. We're hoping that they can impose that culture, that relationship with states, to be able to encourage states to do this more with state resources and capabilities, and then ultimately perhaps on the federal level. So every time there's a paradigm shift, it takes a little while for it to percolate. I think in some number of years, I don't know how many, but this will become a very normal thing, particularly since there's enormous personal health benefit. You can do your test and you can put it into your health kit or in Apple or in Google Health, and you can transmit it to your electronic health records. Your provider can see it. We can do that with our heart rate from our personal wearables. We ought to be able to do that with in vitro diagnostics.
That's an exceptional goal. And yeah, if tying the testing part to early warning, sort of at the community and societal level and national, and then globally as well, this is going to be an important problem to keep making progress on. So it's fantastic that there's some advancements already in that. So there are a couple of questions, and one that we had all relate to the interagency cooperation part. And you saw a lot of logos on one of the slides showing all of the different departments and agencies that contributed to the success of getting tests out there and that have had played a role in RADx. Can you provide a few examples or whatever method, whether it's whoever wants to speak to this, about some examples of how the different agencies tied together? And a few of the questions tie to how things like stockpiling and also some of the DoD's, the defense agencies' unique sort of capabilities play into this. If you or Bruce, anybody would like to say a few words about this aspect?
I think Jill was going to want to comment about some of that in particular with maybe the ITAP perhaps, or.
Yeah, so the RADx really has been an all-of-government response, and we are very closely partnered with not only other agencies in HHS, but the DoD as well. We have worked with the DoD early on when our companies couldn't get swabs to even develop their tests. They were flying them in and making them available to our companies. It was just incredibly helpful. And when the Omicron surge happened and the administration wanted to have freely available tests for everybody, we worked very closely with the FDA to set up this independent test assessment program, ITAP, where we worked with ex-US companies who were reluctant to come to the US because of regulatory requirements here. We worked with them to independently collect all of the data that they needed to get an EUA. We designed the data collection strategy and the templating with our FDA partners, and we were able to get our first EUA of a very high volume test in only 2 months, because we had, and the FDA was working with us. They got update reports from us every week on here's where we are with the clinical trial, here's where we are with the analytical studies. And the FDA was able to take that data, which was in the format they wanted, and that was easy for them to review. They knew that we had collected it independently of the company, so they had a lot of trust in it, and they were able to do the review and authorization very, very quickly. So this level of partnership is completely unprecedented across the government, and it's one of the things that I really hope continues beyond the COVID emergency.
Thank you. Yes. And thank you all again for enabling that. I agree and hope so as well. We had some good, when I was in government on the defense side, there were some good collaborations, but I think nothing quite on the scale, as you said, that has really come to task on this. So it's fantastic and definitely an important lesson for the future. I'll give a last question and maybe a minute or two from each speaker as we get toward the last 5 minutes or so. And that is, what do you hope is the future? So personally, I hope that this the program itself continues. COVID obviously is not over, but the idea of working this way regarding broader sets of infectious disease threats is really exciting in terms of the possibilities that are out there. So I have my own hopes, and you as the leaders and really innovators who helped shape this program, what do you hope is the future of RADx? Maybe Bruce, and then Jill and Rachel to wrap up.
Sure. Well, I'll kind of zero in on some of the challenges that I listed at the end of my presentation. And the number one for all of us always is the performance of the tests. So I think people have a love-hate relationship with over-the-counter tests. They're fantastic, they're accessible, they're fast, but you do certainly read a lot about, well, I got a negative antigen test result, and then I ended up getting COVID 2 days later. The tests themselves, they work as they're supposed to work. So that means that if you have a lot of virus inside you, they work incredibly well. But if the levels of virus are relatively low, modest to low, then the performance is just not as good. So it's not necessarily the variability of the tests from manufacturer to manufacturer. It's really the variability of the infection within different people. And that changes as well over the course of a pandemic with vaccinations and so forth. So we would like to have tests, and we know the technologies exist. We've invested in them. They're in various stages. Some of them are already over the counter on the market, some of the what we call isothermal PCR tests, but they're still not really super affordable. They're fairly inexpensive, but they have excellent performance. And we know there are other platforms that are under development that we are supporting that are in various stages that do work better. And they don't work just a little bit better, they work orders of magnitude better. So we want to get those out, and we know that there's still even more really fantastic approaches that are in laboratories that are kind of part of our community, but people don't move those to manufacturing and commercialize them if there's too much risk. So normally everyone, often talks about the valleys of death and commercialization. Those are related to finding markets, finding proper price points. Many of these technologies have really outstanding performance characteristics, but if nobody wants them, then, or if there's not a mass market for them, then it's really hard to advance and accelerate and expand them. So we hope to be able to play a role in that with the remaining resources that we do have in RADx. And this process that we've introduced to do things more quickly, to have very active partnership across government, academia, industry, that we call it RADxification. I might toss it over to Jill to talk about how RADxification as a concept and as a process is staying on in NIBIB and perhaps hopefully influencing other agencies within NIH and beyond?
Yes, it really has been a huge innovation in process and how we do business at NIH. The ability to review proposals in incredible depth, incredibly quickly, and have an ongoing continuous engagement with the projects as they develop so that we can use our resources wisely and direct them to the successes and away from the things that are struggling. It's that the whole process has been fundamental to the success of this program. And we're already taking a similar strategy now for devices to treat neurological disorders through the NIH Blueprint program, Blueprint MedTech. And we're talking with other institutes at NIH about their particular problems and how a RADx type approach can be applied to be a very goal-directed problem-solving approach for them. And I think the more we can generalize this approach, the more successful NIH will be at solving lots of different kinds of health problems that we've struggled with for many years.
That was going to be my point, my last point as well, the point that Jill just made. I think, I think this country has shown that when it puts its mind to it and resources to it, anything is possible. I mean, we were able to develop these diagnostics for COVID in really warp speed time. And so it just opens up the horizon to thinking it's really not impossible to develop a diagnostic for any range of diseases, and particularly for the public health diseases where there may be less interest from the private sector. Maybe there's a role for government there in as Bruce says, de-risking. I'm working, for example, on hepatitis C right now, which is another infectious disease. And having a point of care diagnostic for a population that really is hard to reach would really be game changing in terms of them being able to access treatment rapidly afterwards. So the development of point of care tests, and they don't have to be home tests. I think there are still concerns there. They can be point of care tests, but that whole infrastructure now is there, and we know nothing is impossible. So I think I'll leave it to say that when our country puts its mind to it, we can really make things happen, and we should take this lesson from COVID and not be daunted by what can be done. So thank you again for inviting us to the panel.
Thank you so much to all three of you, and that is a perfect and inspirational note to end on, and certainly one that you've all exemplified. So thank you again. It's been nothing short of game changing, this aspect of the COVID response, and pointing toward what can be done in the future for aggressively and effectively addressing biological threats as we face them, which is going to continue happening. So thank you all for your great work and for joining us, and thank you to the audience for tuning in today. We will be posting this on CSR's YouTube channel and our website in the coming weeks, and continue spreading it around to various audiences so that more and more people can learn about RADx and this work that you've done and some of the lessons that you've all shared with us today. Thank you again to our panelists and everyone for joining. Stay well, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you.